Do you want to come home with bird photos that look like this, but instead you come home with photos like this? Then it might be that the settings you use for bird photography isn't quite right. In this video, I'll go through the settings that will help you in 90 or 95% of all the shooting scenarios that you'll come across as a bird photographer. So let's get started. First of all, I suggest that you choose an exposure mode that gives you full control of what's actually important in bird photography and only adjust what's the least important. For me, the least important part of exposure is the ISO. That's why I shoot in manual mode with auto ISO. I don't want the camera to choose the shutter speed depending on how much light a scene requires. I want it to set the shutter speed according to what the subject needs in order to cover up any movement blur. Also, I don't want the camera to change the aperture and the depth of field. I still want to use as slow an ISO as possible. I have a way of doing that I'll share with you in just a minute. So let's look at the best aperture settings for bird photography. As you probably know, the aperture controls the depth of field and the light that reaches the sensors. In most cases, I would suggest that you shoot as wide open as your lens is capable of, like at f4 or maybe f5.6, to get in as much light as possible and also get that shallow depth of field, unless you have a really long focal length or that the subject is very close to you. Then you won't have any issues with the subject not being able to fit within that depth of field. However, using a wide open aperture isn't always the best option. If you, for instance, have a budget lens that isn't quite exactly sharp when it's wide open, in that case you might want to stop down the lens a bit to reach that sweet spot where the lens is sharpest. It could be something like f8. So most of the time actually, the aperture stays fixed. You don't need to think about it. It should be wide open or at the sweet spot of your lens. Now for me, one of the worst things that you can get in a bird photo is motion blur. When you're ready to capture a stunning scene and then there's this slight blur of the subject because your shutter speed wasn't fast enough. It's much worse than having an image with a little too high an ISO and therefore a little bit of noise. So let's look at what the optimal shutter speed could be for birds. Most of the time, if I capture shots of birds sitting on a perch, I would go with something like 1/400 or 1/800 of a second. But in reality, you can get much lower than that. Now, flying birds or fast-moving birds or smaller birds requires a lot more in terms of shutter speed. You would have to usually go to 1/2000 or 1/4000 of a second, and this demands a lot of light. Now personally, I'm more interested in the bigger birds like herons, and there you can get away with slower shutter speeds. And here I want you to think something like 1000 or 1/1600 of a second. One common issue when capturing bird photos is that they're most active when there isn't so much light around. So what I usually do is that I set the shutter speed to what I think the subject would need. And then I take some safe shots. But the ISO might be like really high, 6400 or even higher. And so what I do is, once I have the safe shots, I'll gradually lower the shutter speed and take some more shots. And then I see how low I can go. So sometimes I capture photos at 1/200 of a second or even lower using that method. So let's talk about the autofocus settings. I always shoot in continuous autofocus. My camera never leaves that mode. And when I'm doing bird photography, I just switch the subject detection to bird mode. And this makes everything so easy in most scenarios. So if you start with a wide detection area, like covers the entire screen, you're ready for action shots. If your camera can't pick the right subject, if there are multiple subjects and you want to give it a little bit of help, then you just have to narrow down the autofocus area that it uses. Now for older cameras without subject detection, I usually use like 9 focus point and try to place the center point on the eye of the bird if at all possible. And then If for some reason the bird moves out of that center point, or if your position makes the bird go away from that center point, then one of the other points will take over. And this works really well, also when panning or tracking. Now, on most cameras, you can set up when trying to focus whether it should prioritize to get focus before activating the trigger button, so it won't take a photo before the focus is acquired. However, I prefer to set the camera so that it takes the shot even though the photo might not be in focus, because sometimes a shot can look good enough for you, and I would rather have that shot than have missed it completely because the camera didn't think that it was in focus or sharp enough for you to take that shot. So one final thing I want to cover about autofocus is I highly suggest that you use back button focus, where you can press the AF on button on the back of the camera to get focus, and not depending on the trigger button doing both the focusing and taking the photos. You want to separate that. A lot of waterbirds move in and out of reeds, and if you try to take a shot, then your focus might shift suddenly because one of these reeds are in the way. Then you can easily just let go of the focus button and still continue shooting using the focus that you acquired a little earlier, like a few seconds earlier when the bird wasn't behind the reeds. Now, this is another setting that's, for me at least, is almost just set and forget. I always shoot in high speed continuous with as much of frames per second as possible, still using RAW. The only downside to this is that when you're just shooting portrait, you might not want 20 shots of the same duck or coot or grebe or whatever, but it might just be a case of how the head is positioned and whether it's looking away from you or a little bit towards you that makes the shot. So I'm actually okay with having like 20 shots that are just portrait shots. Where it's really comes in handy is when you can anticipate the action, that now this bird is going to take a dive and you want to capture that. You can see, okay, now it's ready, and you can just like hold down the trigger button, and then you'll have captured 120 photos of the entire sequence, and you can go pick out that 1 or 2 or 3 shots that's you would like to process further, where you catch that decisive moment. So let's move on to metering. I use matrix metering for 99% of all scenarios. So if I think there could be an issue with the exposure using matrix metering, then I'll just use exposure compensation to correct that. So for instance, if the scene is overall a very bright scene, then the camera will try to lower the exposure to reach that 18% gray, which darkens the image, and what should be white or bright will look gray instead. So this is when you need to tell the camera that it should keep bright things bright by using an exposure compensation of +1 or a little more. In the opposite scene, where you have a very dark background, the camera might try to lift that exposure up so it reaches 18% gray, but you might want that to keep that dark background from looking like a gray mess and keep the shadows. This is where you need to tell the camera to keep the exposure dark by using -1 or something like that in exposure compensation. Also, always keep an eye out for the histogram. You would generally want to expose your images a little bit to the right so you get home with enough data. So let's take a look at the buttons that I use for making all this come together. So as I mentioned in the section on autofocus, I use the back button to focus instead of the trigger button. Really simple once you get the hang of it. And I'm sure there's a video about it somewhere on Adorama TV that you can look up after this one. What about changing the focus area? You don't want to mess around on the back of the screen. I want fast access to changing the autofocus. My finger is right here on the trigger button. When I want to change the autofocus, I just move it to the record button and press. And there I toggle between 3 or 4 selected AF area modes. So I can very quickly toggle the AF area to precisely what the subject needs. And because speed is really crucial when you're doing bird photography, everything happens so fast. I actually have FN button 1 assigned to immediately go back to a wide AF area mode. So in the case that a bird just takes off to the side, then I can just press the function button 1 and start tracking. The second function button I use for switching between full frame mode and crop mode. So I get that a little bit extra reach and I can quickly come back and forth. So if you think about it, we actually have quite a simple setup right now by shooting the way I just explained. You change the shutter speed, the aperture stays fixed, and the also falls wherever it may. And then you control the focus with dedicated buttons. And that's actually all there is to 90% of all the shooting scenarios. And we'll cover the others in an upcoming video. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. Do remember to subscribe to Adorama TV for thousands of great videos. And I will see you in the next one.